The auction began at 9 in the morning, which Mara Calloway thought was an indecent hour to watch her life get picked apart. She stood at the edge of the yard with her arms crossed over her chest, her back against the peeling white paint of the porch railing, and she watched her neighbors move through the grass with the careful, deliberate pace of people who had decided that what they were doing was necessary and therefore could not be shameful. The folding tables had been set up by 8:30. Helen Marsh from the general store had organized everything, the dishes on one table, the linens on another, the furniture arranged across the lawn in a way that made the living room look like it had simply expanded outside. It was efficient, it was orderly, it was the most humiliating morning of Mara's 29 years. The Hendersons from 2 lots down paid $8 for the set of white saucers that had belonged to Mara's mother. Not the full set. The full set had broken over the years. The way things do in a lived-in house, the way things crack and chip and get glued back together, until one day you stop noticing the seams. What remained was 4 saucers and 2 cups, and the Hendersons counted out $8 from a worn leather wallet and carried them away in a paper bag without looking at her. The Mitchell boy, he couldn't have been more than 20, just married, paid $15 for the armchair. Daniel's chair, the one that had a permanent depression in the left armrest from where he used to rest his hand when he read thumb tracing, the same small oval of worn fabric over and over, through all the years she had known him. The Mitchell boy sat in it briefly to test the springs, declared it solid, and paid in cash. Mara did not cry. This was the thing that troubled people most. She could see it in the sideways glances. The quick looks followed by the quick looking away. A widow who did not cry at her own auction was either made of stone or something had broken inside her that went beyond what tears could address. She suspected her neighbors were not sure which, and she was not certain herself. Daniel Calloway had not been a bad man. She needed to be clear about that, at least in her own mind on this particular morning when his absence was being itemized and sold by the piece. He had been a man with an extraordinary capacity for belief. Belief in the next venture, the next idea, the next iteration of a plan that was always more vivid in the telling than in the doing. He could describe a future so specifically, so warmly, that you felt you were already living in it. This was the quality that had made her fall in love with him at 24 at a church social in Roanoke, where he had spent 40 minutes explaining to her why a small organic farm in the West Virginia mountains was not only viable, but inevitable. His hands moved when he talked. His eyes went bright. She had believed him because he believed himself so completely, and because there is a kind of courage in that certainty that looks from certain angles exactly like wisdom. The farm had not worked out. Neither had the lumber mill partnership, the small engine repair shop, or the consulting business, whose purpose had shifted so many times in the year it existed that Mara still could not have explained it to a stranger. None of these were failures born of laziness. Daniel worked hard at everything he started. The failures were structural, architectural, the way a beautiful building fails when it is built on the wrong ground. He simply did not have the particular skepticism required to distinguish between a good idea and an idea that felt good. He died in March, a truck accident on Route 219, a patch of black ice that the county had flagged but not yet sanded, and then a stillness that settled over everything she had known for 5 years and did not lift. The debt he left behind came to $47,000, a number the estate attorney delivered in a quiet, professional tone that somehow made it worse. The house, the truck, the equipment from the last venture, all of it liquidated over the following weeks, a process that was handled by people who were very good at their jobs and left Mara feeling like furniture herself, something being efficiently relocated. What remained when the process was finished, a small wooden chest containing Daniel's personal effects, including a worn leather notebook that had belonged to his estranged Uncle Harold, her own clothes, $340 in a checking account, and the deed to a parcel of land in Randolph County called Goats Ridge, 4 acres of exposed granite and shallow soil on a mountain shoulder, so reliably useless that it had passed through 3 generations of the Calloway family without anyone bothering to sell it, because selling it would have required finding someone willing to buy it. The estate attorney had explained the deed as a footnote, the last item on a list of assets that had already been exhausted. Harold Calloway Daniels' father's brother had lived on the land alone for nearly 2 decades before dying of a stroke 6 years ago. He had left it to Daniel because there was no one else to leave it to, and Daniel had kept it because it cost him nothing, and because he had talked in his way about maybe doing something with it someday. Now it was Mara's, along with the debt and the chair that the Mitchell boy was loading into the back of his truck. Garrett Calloway arrived the following morning. She heard his truck on the gravel before she saw him, the sound of an engine that had been recently serviced, expensive and deliberate. She was in the kitchen, which was already nearly empty, drinking coffee from the one mug she had kept back from the auction, on the grounds that a person needed at least one mug. Garrett came around the side of the house rather than to the front door, which she noticed. He was 45 thick across the shoulders in a way that suggested he had done physical work in his 30s and maintained the shape without maintaining the habit. His flannel shirt was clean and pressed. He wore it like a costume, the way men in his position sometimes did, dressed like the workers he employed, which made it easier to stand next to them and harder to remember you were not one of them. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited and placed a folded check on the table between them. His hands were flat on either side of it. His voice was the voice of someone who had decided in advance that this would go well. "Let me take this from you, Mara. Goats Ridge is no place for a woman alone. You know what, that land is worth nothing, practically. But I can give you something for it, something that it could get you back to Roanoke, back to your parents, let you start fresh somewhere that makes sense." He paused. 3,200. I know it's not much. Think of it as getting clear of one more thing. She looked at the check. She looked at Garrett. Then she looked past him through the window above the sink at the gray outline of the mountains visible through the bare November trees, the long ridge line that ran north to south, the particular shoulder of it, where Goats Ridge sat above the tree line. Garrett followed her gaze without meaning to. It lasted only a second, less than a second, but she saw it the way his attention moved toward the ridge before he pulled it back. His eyes returned to her face. His expression had not changed. His expression was charitable concern, the face of a man doing a favor. But his eyes had gone to that ridge before he remembered not to let them. She pushed the check back across the table. "No, thank you, Garrett." The change in his face was small and fast, a compression around the jaw, a fraction of a second, where something genuine replaced something practiced. Then it was gone, and he was nodding, gathering the check back with the unhurried movement of someone who had expected this and was not troubled by it. He told her the offer would stand. He told her to think about it. He told her that mountain winters were no place for grief, and that nobody would think less of her for being practical. His tone held throughout, warm, slightly sorrowful, the tone of a man who had told himself he was doing the right thing for long enough that he almost meant it. After he left, Mara sat at the empty kitchen table for a long time. She was not thinking about what he had said. She was thinking about where his eyes had gone. The hardware store in Millhaven was 4 blocks from the main intersection, a small, dense space run by a man named Pete Greer, who sold things that worked and did not stock things that did not. Mara spent an hour moving through the aisles, adding and subtracting from her mental list based on what she could carry and what her $340 could cover. She bought a canvas tent rated to 15 degrees, a short-handled spade and a long-handled one, a pickaxe with a hickory handle, a 4-pound mallet, 2 sacks of dried pinto beans, 1 of flour, 1 of rice, a tin of coffee ground salt, a box of heavy-gauge contractor bags. She carried it all to the counter in 3 loads. Pete Greer rang it up without comment, which she respected. He had known Daniel had extended credit to him twice for things that were paid back slowly and with difficulty. He had the look of a man who understood what this purchase meant and had decided it was not his place to say so. The total came to $286. He packed it into cardboard boxes and helped her load it into the truck she had borrowed from Earl Dutton's farm at the base of the ridge, Earl had left it unlocked with the keys on the seat, which was a form of communication she was only beginning to understand. She returned the truck to Earl's farm that evening, left it where she found it, did not see Earl himself. His lights were on in the back of the house, and she did not knock. She left a handwritten note on the seat that said simply, "Thank you." Then she walked up the mountain road in the last light, carrying what she could, and left the rest at the bottom of the trail to retrieve the next day. Helen Marsh caught her before she made it out of the store with her supplies. Not physically, Mara was nearly to the door when Helen appeared from the back room with the precise timing of someone who had been watching, which she had been. Helen was 65, had run the Millhaven General Store for 31 years, and communicated primarily through the precision of what she chose to include and what she chose to leave out. She handed Mara a paper bag. Inside, a box of wooden matches and 2 tallow candles, thick and slow-burning, the kind that lasted through a winter night. Helen said nothing. She looked at Mara with an expression that was not pity and was not approval, and contained some of both, and then she went back to the counter. Mara put the bag in her pocket and left. She thought about what the candles meant, not the candles themselves, but the choice to include them, without comment for a long time as she walked. The trail up to Goats Ridge was not a trail in any maintained sense of the word. It was the memory of a trail, the suggestion left by years of deer, and the occasional human passage marked in faint depressions through the brown grass and the skeletal scrub of late autumn gorse. The grade steepened quickly past the first quarter mile, and the loose shale that broke through the thin soil made every step a small negotiation. She made 3 trips up the mountain in 2 days, carrying supplies and loads that left her legs burning and her breathing ragged by the top. She was not in poor shape, but she was not in the shape of someone who had been moving heavy things over steep terrain, and the mountain made the distinction clear. Goats Ridge opened up without ceremony. At the end of the trail, a broad exposed shoulder of granite and thin soil, the trees falling away on both sides and leaving only the wind and the gray sky and the particular bleak beauty of a high place that had never been tamed. The views were extraordinary, she would acknowledge that. On a clear day, you could see 3 counties, the folded blue ridges stacking up to the horizon like something from a painting. But the wind up there was another matter. The locals called it the Gray Widow. She had heard the name without quite believing it until she felt it the way it came, not in gusts, but in a sustained pressure, an insistence like something that had decided to move you and was prepared to be patient about it. At the center of the ridge stood what remained of Stone Hollow, Harold Calloway's cabin. Calling it ruins was almost generous. It was 4 courses of dry stacked granite walls standing to about shoulder height, open to the sky where the roof had been. The interior choked with decades of accumulated debris, fallen stone-blown leaves compressed into black mats, the remains of what might have been a small iron stove, corroded past identification. The workmanship of the original walls was good. She could see that much even in the state they were in, the stones chosen and fitted with care, each one locked against the next with attention to weight and angle. Whoever had built this had known what they were doing. Harold, she assumed. The same Harold whose notebook she had found in Daniel's chest. She set up the tent in the most sheltered corner of the ruin, where the 2 intact walls met, and reduced the wind to something approaching manageable. It took her 40 minutes because the tent poles were unfamiliar and her fingers were already cold. And at one point, the whole thing collapsed sideways in a gust, and she had to start from the staking. When it was done, she sat inside it on top of her sleeping bag and ate a cold biscuit she had made that morning and listened to the canvas snap and pull at its stakes with the sound of something fighting to escape. That first night she slept in 3-hour intervals, waking each time to the sound of the wind and the cold that had worked its way through every layer she had put between herself and it. The second night was worse. The third, she stopped expecting sleep and simply endured the hours tracking them by the slow shift of the draft along the tent floor. She had opened Harold's notebook on the second evening in the thin light of the first candle from Helen's paper bag. The notebook was 73 pages dense with Harold's handwriting, a cramped leftward slant that took some getting used to. It was organized the way a practical man organizes things he needs to remember, not chronologically, but by subject with no dates and no narrative, just information recorded for future use. There were notes on the local stone, which seams ran, where which granite fractured cleanly and which crumbled. There were sketches of wall joints labeled in Harold's shorthand. There were plant lists and soil observations and notations about water drainage. And on page 22, circled once in pencil with no further comment, a single line: "The hollow breathes warm in November. Listen." She read it 3 times, set the notebook down, picked it up and read it again. On the 7th morning, she was working through the interior of Stone Hollow, pulling debris out of the corners, moving the smaller loose stones to get a clear picture of the original foundation layout. The work was methodical and thankless. Cold stone, cold fingers, her breath making white puffs in the hollow interior. She had found 2 intact lengths of what might have once been a roof beam, too rotted to use, but proof that the structure had at some point been complete and functional. She was working at the northern interior wall where a section of the floor was buried under a large flat slab of granite that had fallen inward at some point, probably when the roof went. She worked the spade under the edge of the slab, found purchase lean. The slab shifted with the grinding sound of stone against stone tilted, and she got her hands under the edge and levered it up and aside. It fell with a heavy crack against the wall behind her. The air from the cavity beneath moved across her face before she understood what it was. She went still. Her hands were still braced on the edges of the displaced stone. The cavity was roughly the size of a large suitcase, the walls unexcavated earth and granite, the floor invisible in the shadow. She leaned closer, held the back of her hand over the opening, and counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The warmth was undeniable. Not heat, not even warmth in the way a room with a fire is warm. But against the November air above there that had been stripping the feeling from her fingers for the past hour, it was an entirely different temperature. A steady, neutral underground temperature that did not fluctuate and did not apologize, and was simply their constant, insistent belonging to some other system entirely than the weather trying to outlast her above. She put her cheek close to the opening. The smell reached her before anything else, damp earth mineral, and dark, the smell of stone that had not seen light in a long time, of soil that had never dried out of the deep down places where the surface world does not reach. It was the smell of a root cellar in late autumn. It was the smell of something that had been keeping its temperature quietly and without effort since before anyone on this mountain was alive. The memory arrived unbidden and precise. Her grandmother's back porch in the house outside Pikeville, Kentucky. A winter afternoon, Mara, 8 years old. Grandma Ruth sitting in the old cane-back rocker with both hands around a mug of coffee, looking out at the snow coming down through the bare hickory trees. Grandma Ruth, who had grown up in a hollow in the mountains before the roads came through, who had lived through winters that modern people did not believe when she described them, who knew things about cold and earth and survival that she had learned not from books, but from necessity. Her voice when she talked about those things always dropped to a lower register, unhurried, like she was saying something she did not need to raise her voice to make true. The earth has a slow heart, child. The summer sun sinks down into the soil and the rock and keeps going deeper and deeper. And by the time it gets cold up here on top, that warmth is still moving down below. The mountain holds a secret summer in its bones, deep enough the ground never forgets July. Mara at 8 had thought this was poetry, the kind of thing old people said, beautiful and not quite literal. She had filed it away with the other beautiful, inexact things her grandmother told her, and had not thought about it again in any practical sense in 21 years. She was thinking about it now. Practically. She pulled back from the cavity and sat on the stone she had displaced and looked at the space around her. The 4 walls of Stone Hollow, the open sky where the roof had been the shallow depression of the original foundation that Harold had dug before he laid his first course. He had gone down a few feet enough to anchor the walls enough to use the earth as a partial windbreak. Not deep enough, maybe, but deep enough to find what she had just found. She looked at the walls, the good dry stack work, the stones chosen and fitted. She looked at the slope of the ridge behind the structure, the way the ground rose sharply to the north tones of mountain pressing against the back of what had been Harold's cabin. She looked at the cavity and felt the warmth continuing to breathe out of it, patient, steady, indifferent to the season. Everyone who had ever built anything on this mountain had built up. Added walls, added insulation, added firewood, fought the cold from the outside and trying to maintain a pocket of warmth in a hostile environment by burning things. It was what you did. It was what houses were. What if the direction was wrong? What if the answer was not up, but down, not fighting the cold, but stepping out of its range entirely down into the part of the mountain that had not received the memo about November? She thought about what that would require. She had a spade, a pickaxe, a mallet. She had the walls of Stone Hollow already standing, already doing work. She had Harold's notebook with its notes on the local stone and its circled line about the hollow breathing warm. She had nothing else. No lumber, no money for materials, no expertise, no way to call anyone who would come. She had a canvas tent that was losing the argument with the weather a little more each night. Mara sat with the idea for a long time, long enough for the cold to work its way back into her hands and make itself uncomfortable. She thought about what Garrett had said, the mountain doesn't care for grief, and she thought about the check he had put on her kitchen table with his hands flat on either side of it, and she thought about the way his eyes had moved to the ridge before he caught himself. She thought about the Mitchell boy counting out $15 for Daniel's chair, and Helen Marsh putting 2 candles in a bag and saying nothing, and Earl Dutton leaving a truck unlocked with the keys on the seat. She thought about Grandma Ruth in the caneback rocker and the way snow looked falling through bare hickory branches when you were 8 years old and certain the world made sense. Then she stopped thinking and picked up the pickaxe. The first blow landed awkwardly. She had not swung a pickaxe before and the angle was wrong, and the head skipped off the frozen topsoil rather than biting. She adjusted her grip, changed her stance, tried again. The second blow landed better, the point driving in 1.5 inches and coming back dirty. She found a rhythm by the 4th or 5th swing, not efficient yet, but improving. The frozen top layer was the hard part, she realized quickly, dense and resistant, requiring more force per inch than the unfrozen soil below. But it was also thin. By mid-morning, she had broken through it over a 4-foot section, and the digging got easier, the color of the soil changing from gray-brown to dark reddish-brown as she went down. She did not think about how long it would take. She did not think about whether it would work. Thinking about those things was a way of standing still, and she could not afford to stand still. She thought about the next 6 inches of earth and where to put the pickaxe and how to position the spade to clear what the pickaxe loosened. By evening, she had a depression roughly 5 feet wide and 8 inches deep in the floor of Stone Hollow's foundation, radiating out from the cavity she had uncovered. Her hands, even inside the gloves Earl had left her, were raw at the joints. Her lower back was a single continuous complaint. She ate beans from a tin she had heated on the small camp stove and sat in the tent and opened Harold's notebook to the section on stonework. The drawings were small but careful joint patterns, base courses, the angle of header stones used to lock a dry stack wall. Harold had included a section on corbelling that she read twice, a technique for creating a shallow arch using overlapping stone courses, each one projecting slightly inward from the one below. You could roof a small space that way if the span was not too great, if the stones were chosen carefully. Root cellars had been built this way for 200 years in the Appalachians. No mortar, no timber, just stone on stone on stone. Harold had not labeled the sketch, but the application was obvious. She studied the angle of projection until she understood the geometry and then closed the notebook and tried to sleep. Garrett came to the ridge on the 11th day and he did not come alone. She saw them coming up the trail from 50 yards, Garrett in front, and behind him a younger man in a tan uniform jacket that she recognized as belonging to the county sheriff's department. Deputy Ron Hicks, who she knew by sight from the gas station on Route 219. Hicks was not a large man, but he had the particular posture of someone who had learned to use his position as an extension of his physical presence. a habit of standing that said he was entitled to take up more space than he actually occupied. She kept working. She was at the stage of excavation where the cavity was widening into something that might be called a room 9 feet wide, now almost 4 feet deep at the center, the earth walls darkening as she went, and the temperature differential becoming more pronounced each day. She had learned to feel it without thinking about it, the way the air in the pit was different from the air above. The way stepping down into the excavation was like stepping into a different agreement between the atmosphere and the ground. Garrett stood at the edge and looked down. His expression was difficult to read. It had the shape of concern and something else underneath it. That concern was not something assessing and proprietary. Hicks stood beside him with his thumbs in his belt and looked at the hole with the blank, evaluative look of a man doing a job he had been told was a wellness check. Mara. Garrett's voice was the same voice as the kitchen table charitable, warmed the temperature of something that had not been left in the cold. We've been worried about you up here. Ron came along because we wanted to make sure you're all right. She climbed out of the excavation and stood at its edge, brushing dirt from her gloves. She was aware of how she looked, mud on her coat, her hair unwashed, the general appearance of someone who had been sleeping in a tent on a mountain in November. She looked at Hicks. I'm all right. Hicks asked his questions in the careful, neutral tone of protocol. Did she have adequate shelter? Did she have food? Was there someone who knew she was here? Did she have a plan? She answered each one. Adequate shelter, working on it. Food, yes. Someone who knew, yes. Plan, yes. Hicks listened, wrote nothing down, and looked at her with an expression that was honest enough. He did not see what he needed to see to intervene. She was not in crisis, not confused, not incapacitated. She was dirty and cold and clearly determined. Before he turned to go, he stepped slightly closer and dropped his voice in the way of someone passing along information rather than making a statement. Mr. Calloway's been asking about you in town. He's got some concerns about the property situation. He's patient, but he's got relationships in this county. He paused. Just wanted you to know. She held his gaze. He held hers for a moment, then looked away first, not guiltily, just with the look of a man who has delivered a message and is done with that part. They went back down the trail, and she watched them go, then climbed back into the excavation and picked up the spade. She understood what the warning meant without needing to decode it. Garrett had resources she did not. He had time on his side, or thought he did, because he believed her stubbornness was a temporary condition, the product of grief and poor judgment that would resolve itself before long. He was patient because he thought he could afford to be. What she could not figure out was why. The land was worthless. Everyone said so. Everyone had always said so. There was no reason for a man with Garrett's resources and local position to spend this much attention on 4 acres of granite that had been the punchline of a county joke for 3 generations. The answer arrived 9 days later, left at the bottom of the trail in the weekly supplies from Earl, who communicated only in objects and never in words. Along with a small sack of potatoes and a half-wheel of yellow cheese, there was a copy of the Randolph County Recorder from 6 months prior, folded open to page 3. She read it standing in the wind at the bottom of the trail, and the cold stopped registering. The headline was unremarkable. An informational county commission, green lights, wind energy, site survey, ridgeline parcels in multiple districts under review. The article was 4 paragraphs. The 3rd paragraph listed survey areas. Goats Ridge was one of 12 named sites. Optimal elevation, minimal tree cover, documented wind consistency. The article used language borrowed from an engineering assessment and did not attempt to translate it. But Mara had been living on the ridge for weeks now, and she did not need it translated. She knew what that wind was worth to someone with the capital to put up turbines and the connections to move a county approval through. $3,200. Paid in full and go back to Roanoke before the first snow. She folded the newspaper and put it in her coat pocket and walked back up the trail. The work had clarified itself by this point from general excavation into something more specific. The footprint of Stone Hollow's original foundation gave her the perimeter roughly 10 by 15 feet walls, already partially standing on three sides to a height of 3 to 4 courses. The plan was to dig the interior down by 3 feet from the original floor level, which would bring the total effective depth, including the height of the retained earth on the uphill side, to somewhere between 6 and 8 feet, depending on where you stood. The uphill bank, the mountain pressing against the back wall, was already acting as a windbreak and would become a thermal mass once the interior was complete. The front would need new wall work to replace the damaged courses and bring everything to a consistent height. She had sorted the excavated stones into 3 piles, large flat-faced slabs for the corbel roof, medium stones with at least one good face for wall courses, and rubble for fill and packing. The sorting had taken time she might have spent digging, but Harold's notebook was clear that dry stack work done with poorly chosen stones failed quickly and sometimes badly, and she could not afford to rebuild. The corbel roof was the problem she returned to most often at night, lying in the tent that had begun to develop a small tear along one seam and would not survive another month. The span was too wide to cross in a single course, but Harold's sketches suggested a method: build the walls to full height, then begin corbelling inward from both sides simultaneously, each course overlapping the last by no more than a third of the stone's depth. The center gap, when the corbelling had reduced the span sufficiently, could be bridged with the largest flat slabs, which would not need to carry the same lateral load as the outer sections. Packed clay on top, then earth, then the turf that would help it disappear into the hillside. She understood the geometry. She understood the principle. What she could not yet fully calculate was whether her arms would hold out long enough to execute it. On the 17th day of work, she was fitting a large flat coarse stone onto the east wall when a sound reached her from below, the slow measured footstep of someone who was not in a hurry because he was not the one doing the work. She looked up from the wall. Earl Dutton stood 20 feet away, hands in his jacket pockets, watching her. He was 63 years old and had the build of a man who had spent 40 years doing physical labor and not much of it sitting down. His face was a working face, not weathered in a romantic way, but in a functional one. The skin around his eyes creased from years of squinting at the distance between where things were and where he needed them to be. He had been a widower for 3 years. She knew this the way you know things about people you have not met. Through accumulation, the empty truck on Sunday mornings, the single-place setting she had glimpsed through the kitchen window when she returned the borrowed vehicle. He looked at the excavation, looked at the wall courses she had completed, looked at the sorted stone piles in the corbelled section she had started at the rear where the bank was highest. He was doing the same thing she did when she looked at a problem, not judging it, measuring it. "Your hands are a wreck," he said. It was not the beginning of a lecture. It was an observation. She looked at her hands. The gloves he had left her had helped, but the work had been hard enough on them anyway, and the seams of the leather were dark with ground-in dirt, and there was a long split along the left thumb where the material had given out. Underneath her palms were not pretty. "I'm managing," she said. He pulled a fresh pair of gloves from his jacket pocket and held them out. Better than the first pair, heavy grain leather with a reinforced palm, the kind sold at Pete Greer's hardware store for $14 that she had looked at and put back on the shelf. She took them. "Your roof design," he said, nodding toward the rear corbelling. "You're going to lose that section if you don't key the stones into the bank at the rear. The weight will push inward over time." She looked at the section in question. He was right. The rear courses needed to angle back into the earth bank rather than sitting flush against it. "Harold's notebook," she said. "It didn't cover that part." "Harold was a good stone man," Earl said. "Didn't always think about the long term." He looked at the mountain rising behind Stone Hollow, the weight of it. "He should have keyed them in. So should you." He did not offer to help. He turned and walked back down the trail. She watched him go, then looked at the rear wall, then at the new gloves in her hand. She put them on and went back to work. The cold deepened through the end of November. with the slow, deliberate quality of something that had all the time in the world. The morning temperatures dropped below 20. The water in her camp stove's reservoir froze overnight and had to be thawed before she could make coffee. The tent's torn seam expanded in the wind, and she repaired it with duct tape that was marginally better than nothing. She kept working. The excavation was finished in the last week of November. 3 feet down from the original floor, the earth walls consistent and firm. The drainage channels Harold's notes had described cut along the interior base. She stood in the completed pit on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky the color of old pewter above the open roof space, and felt what she had spent weeks working toward. The air around her was cooler than an indoor room, but it was not the air of outside. It was the air of inside the mountains, still and neutral and governed by a different system than the one that was currently trying to strip leaves off the last few scrubby trees on the ridge. She lit one of Helen's candles and set it on the flat stone that would become the center of the floor. The flame stood straight up without trembling. She looked at it for a long time. The candle burned evenly, the wax melting in a perfect, symmetrical pool, the light pushing out steadily against the earthen walls. Up above, the Gray Widow was moving at 30 miles an hour across the open ridge, and in the excavation that Mara had spent 23 days digging with a pickaxe and a spade and Harold Calloway's 60-year-old notebook, a candle flame held itself as still as something that had decided the weather was not its problem. She thought of Grandma Ruth's voice in the low register she used when she was saying something true. Deep enough, the ground never forgets July. Then she picked up the mallet and went back to work on the wall. The Corbell roof took 11 days and came close to killing her twice. The first time was on the third day of the roofing work, when a flagstone she had positioned at the top of the east wall shifted as she was leaning across it to set the next course. The stone moved maybe 4 inches before it stopped, caught by friction and the angle of the course below it, but 4 inches was enough to throw her weight forward, and she went down hard on her forearms onto the raw edge of the wall, the impact traveling up through her elbows and into her shoulders in a single white-hot line. She lay across the wall for a moment, cheek against cold granite, breathing. Nothing broken. She could tell that much from the quality of the pain, which was sharp and superficial, rather than deep and structural. She pushed herself up, repositioned the shifted stone, and kept working. The second time was subtler and therefore more dangerous. On the 8th day in the late afternoon, when the light was going flat and her judgment was going with it, she placed a header stone that was a 1/4 inch too short on its bearing surface. She did not see it. She set the next course on top of it and moved to the other side of the roof to continue corbelling from the west. She was 3 stones into the west progression when something made her stop, not a sound, not a visible movement, just a quality in the air, the particular silence that precedes a shift. She stepped back and looked at the east section. The header stone had torqued almost imperceptibly under the new load rotating in place, the short bearing surface compressing the course below in a way that was going to fail. Maybe in an hour, maybe in 3 days, but fail. She spent the rest of the afternoon dismantling 4 courses of work and rebuilding them with a header stone that had 3 more inches of bearing surface. When she was done, she sat in the dark in the excavation for a while and thought about the difference between doing a thing and doing a thing correctly, and how the distance between those two conditions was often invisible until it was not. Earl came up the trail on the morning of the 12th day, which was the first time he had been to the site since his brief visit weeks before. He came alone, carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of glass jars, and he stood at the edge of what had been the open top of Stone Hollow and looked at the roof for a long time without speaking. The corbelling was complete on both sides, reducing the center gap to a span of roughly 4 feet, which she had bridged with 3 large flat slabs hauled from the stone pile with the lever system. Harold's notebook had described a hickory pole as long as she could find, and a fulcrum stone, the physics of it simple and unforgiving of error. On top of the slabs, she had packed 6 inches of the clay-heavy soil from the excavation. Then the turf she had cut from the hillside to the north laid green side up, already beginning to knit at the edges. From where Earl stood, the structure was almost invisible. The front face of dry stacked granite rose to about 5.5 feet, the doorway cut through it at a height that required ducking. And above that, the ground simply continued the ridge slope, running up and over the top of what was now a room inside the mountain rather than a ruin on its surface. You keyed the rear courses, Earl observed. She had. The rear wall stones angled back into the earth bank at 12 degrees, binding the structure to the mountain rather than merely leaning against it. He set the canvas bag down and pulled out 4 mason jars, 2 of canned tomatoes, 1 of pickled green beans, 1 of what looked like apple butter, then a folded paper which he held out without ceremony. She unfolded it, a hand-drawn map of the site showing contour lines she recognized as Goat's Ridge, with a dotted line indicating where a drainage channel should be cut to divert surface water away from the front face of the structure before the spring thaw. The draftsmanship was careful. He had clearly sat down and thought about it. She looked at the map, then at him. He was already looking somewhere else at the turbine survey markers she had noticed the previous week, small orange flags on wire stakes planted at intervals along the upper ridgeline, the kind used by survey crews to mark sampling points. She had known what they were without knowing, and then the newspaper article from the bottom of the trail had confirmed it. "How many did they put in?" she asked, meaning the flags. 14 along the main ridge." He paused. 3 are on your property line." She folded the map and put it in her pocket. He picked up the empty canvas bag. He was halfway down the trail before she called after him, "Earl." He stopped but did not turn. "Thank you for the food, all of it." A pause long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then without turning, "My wife would have done the same thing you're doing, probably done it faster." He kept walking. She stood there for a moment with that sentence which landed differently than sympathy and carried more weight than admiration. Then she went inside to check the drainage of the floor. The interior of the finished structure was 10 feet wide and 14 feet deep. The ceiling height at the entrance 5.5 feet rising to 6 feet at the rear, where the earthen floor had been leveled. The walls were cold to the touch, but not wet. The drainage channels were working, and the clay-heavy soil was wicking rather than pooling. The air held the same steady underground temperature she had found in the cavity weeks ago, slightly cool, completely windless, carrying the mineral smell of deep earth that she had stopped noticing, the way you stop noticing the smell of your own house. She set up the salvaged metal drum stove in the left rear corner, running the exhaust pipe up through a chimney sleeve she had packed with small stone and sealed with the last of the clay. The bed frame was 4 lengths of hickory branch lashed at the corners and strung with salvaged rope from the tense guy lines the sleeping bag laid on top. A plank table. A 3-legged stool she had made badly and repaired twice. She lit the stove with a handful of the driest wood she had and let it run for an hour. The temperature inside rose to what she estimated was 60 degrees without the stove working hard. She turned it down to its lowest setting and the temperature held. She sat on the stool and thought about what that meant for winter. The answer to that question arrived in the form of a letter delivered by Helen Marsh, who had climbed the trail for the 2nd time in a week, looking like she intended it to be the last time. She was breathing hard when she reached the top, and she stood with her hands on her knees for a moment before producing a manila envelope from inside her coat. The return address was a law office in Elkins. Mara read it, standing in the wind with Helen watching her face. It was a formal notice of a quiet title action filed by Garrett T. Calloway in Randolph County Circuit Court, claiming that the deed transferring Goat's Ridge from Harold Calloway to Daniel Calloway was defective due to a deficiency in the notarization on the transfer instrument. The hearing date was 6 weeks out, the first week of January. A response was required within 21 days, or the action would proceed unopposed. She read it twice, folded it back into the envelope. Helen was watching her with the expression of someone who has delivered bad news and is prepared to stay in the vicinity of it. "He's claiming the deed is bad," Mara said. "I know what it says." Helen straightened up. "I read law at Morgantown for 2 years before my father got sick, and I came back." A pause. "Quiet title actions in this county, there's a history. Mineral rights, timber rights, going back 100 years. People who know that history do well. People who don't. Another pause. You should talk to Earl Dutton tonight. Mara looked at her. Helen's expression had not changed. It was the expression of someone who had survived 31 years of small-town commerce by knowing which information to move and when. She turned and began picking her way back down the trail before Mara could respond. Earl's kitchen was the kitchen of a man who cooked the same reliable things repeatedly and had arranged the space to support that specific activity. No clutter, nothing decorative, the cast iron on the stove worn to a dark polish from decades of use. He poured coffee without asking and sat down across from her and read the legal notice with the unhurried attention of someone who has learned not to react to things before he understands them. Garrett filed this because he's out of moves that don't leave a paper trail, Earl said, setting the document down. He's been working this county for 20 years on handshakes and poker nights. A lawsuit is a different kind of play. Means he's impatient. She asked why impatient meant now, specifically. Earl picked up the notice and looked at it again. He told her that the wind survey had concluded 6 weeks ago, and the preliminary results had gone to the county commission in a sealed report. He told her that the commission had a scheduled session in February where they would vote on which sites to advance to the development phase. He told her that a man who needed clear title to a specific parcel of ridgeline land before February would be exactly as impatient as Garrett appeared to be. She sat with this. Do I have any case? Earl looked at the return address on the envelope. He picked up the phone on the kitchen wall, an actual wall phone, corded the kind that had been there since before his wife died, and dialed a number from memory. His son answered on the second ring. Jake Dutton, 35, a structural engineer in Charleston, who called on Friday evenings and listened to his father describe things that needed doing on the farm with the patient attention of someone who had come to understand that the farm was his father's primary language. Earl explained the situation in the same way he described a drainage problem or a fence post that had heaved in the frost, factually without drama, identifying the components and their relationship to each other. He asked Jake if he knew anyone who worked quiet title cases in the Eastern District. Jake said he did. Rebecca Oates Morgantown, who had clerked for a federal judge and then spent 15 years on Appalachian property law, which was its own discipline, a specialized field born from the complexity of land transfers, going back to the original land grants. The Coal and Timber Company purchases the decades of informal conveyances that had never been properly recorded. She took cases on their merits. She had a particular interest in cases where a large interest was using procedural deficiency to acquire land from someone without the resources to fight back, which was a pattern with a long regional history. Jake said he would call her that night. Mara walked back up the mountain in the dark using the flashlight she kept clipped to her coat and went inside and shut the door and sat on the stool for a while. The stove had been cold for hours, but the interior temperature was still 48 degrees. Outside, the thermometer she had nailed to a post near the entrance read 19. The difference between inside and outside was not the stove. The stove was off. The difference was 29 feet of mountain pressed against 3 walls, and over the roof holding the summer it had absorbed 6 months ago in its deep, indifferent memory. She put a small piece of wood in the stove and lit it, and watched the temperature climb to 55, and then to 60, and then she turned the damper down until it was barely burning and the temperature held. One small piece of wood. She thought about that. Rebecca Oates called Earl's farm 3 days later, and Earl walked up the trail to get Mara, which was the first time he had come twice to the site in the same month. He stood at the entrance and said that the lawyer was on the phone and wanted to talk, and Mara came down to the farm and took the phone in Earl's kitchen while Earl went outside and did something that involved the tractor and did not require him to be in the room. Rebecca Oates had a voice that suggested she had long ago finished being impressed by things that were designed to impress her. She asked direct questions and listened to the answers without interjecting. And when Mara was done, she said she had looked at the county records that morning. The original deed from Harold to Daniel Calloway, executed in 1987, was in the county clerk's archive. The copy that Garrett's attorneys had filed as their exhibit was a photocopy of a document that was missing its final page, the page containing the notary's seal and signature, the recording stamp, and the county clerk's certification. The original was complete. It had been properly recorded and properly notarized. Garrett's case was built on a photocopy that was missing the page that proved the deed was valid. Mara asked if that meant the case would be dismissed. Rebecca said it meant the case should be dismissed and that she would file a motion to produce the original document and a motion to dismiss on the grounds that Garrett's exhibit did not accurately represent the recorded instrument. She said the hearing would probably not be necessary if the judge was paying attention, but that she would be there regardless. She also said before hanging up that she would not charge for the work. She said this not as a favor but as a statement of position, the way someone announces they are declining something they consider beneath them. I don't charge for cases that exist because someone thought a grieving widow wouldn't fight back. The legal situation resolved itself 6 weeks later in a Elkins courtroom that smelled of old carpet and heating oil. Mara sat at the respondent's table in her cleanest clothes, which were not very clean, and watched Rebecca Oates present the original deed with the calm efficiency of someone removing an argument from the table. Garrett sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a man in a good suit who had clearly been told the case was stronger than it was. The judge looked at the original document, looked at the photocopy, looked at Garrett's attorney with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously, and none of them favorable, and granted the motion to dismiss before noon. Garrett walked out of the courthouse without looking at Mara. His attorney was speaking quietly in his ear, and he was nodding with the compressed jaw of a man absorbing a setback he had not prepared for. The information in the court record, the wind survey, the timing of his offer, the photocopy was now public. It would appear in the Randolph County Recorder within the week. In a county of 14,000 people, that appearance would do specific and lasting damage to the particular currency Garrett Calloway had been spending for 20 years. Mara stood on the courthouse steps in the December cold, and Rebecca Oates stood next to her, and they looked at the street. "He's not going to be charged with anything," Rebecca said. "Using a bad copy isn't fraud if you can argue you didn't know it was incomplete. He'll argue that." "I know," Mara said. "The wind farm decision is in February. You'll be in the survey zone regardless of what he does now. The lease income won't make you rich." "I know that too." Rebecca looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in that vicinity. Harold Calloway recorded that deed himself, walked it down to the county clerk and paid the $6 filing fee and watched them stamp it. His signature is on the original in a very careful hand. He knew somebody would need it someday. She paused. He just didn't know who. Mara thought about Harold, whom she had never met, who had lived alone on Goats Ridge for 19 years and died there and left behind 4 acres of bad land and a notebook full of careful drawings in a single circled line about the ground breathing warm in November. She thought about what it meant to leave something useful for a stranger you would never know. She drove back to Millhaven and walked up the mountain. The structure was complete and had been for 2 weeks, but she had continued working on it in the way of someone who understands that the difference between finished and sufficient is not semantic. She had added a second drainage channel on the east side after a heavy rain had shown her a path that surface water wanted to take. She had caulked the gap between the door frame and the stone surround with a mixture of clay and dry grass that she had found described in Harold's notebook under the heading weatherproofing, and that worked better than she expected. She had built a small storage niche into the east wall, fitting 3 flat stones to create a shelf that was cool and dry better than her tent had ever been for keeping food. The door was the thing she was proudest of, which surprised her because it was also the roughest piece of work in the structure. It was built from the planks of the packing crates her supplies had come in, fitted together with salvaged nails. She had straightened one by one with the mallet and insulated on the inside face with a quilted layer of canvas from the tent and the wool from a blanket that had been beyond saving. It fit badly. There was a gap at the top right corner that she had chimed 3 times and still had not fully solved, but when it was closed, it stopped the wind with an abruptness that was startling. You could hear the gray widow on the other side of it, like weather in another county. The forecast came over Earl's battery radio on the 18th of December, and Earl drove up the mountain road and parked at the trailhead and walked up to tell her himself, which was not something he had done before. She was inside rearranging the food stores on the new shelf when she heard his knock, a single flat knock. No particular urgency. The knock of a man who has something to say and has decided to say it in person. She opened the door. He stood in the entrance and looked in at the interior, which was the first time he had been inside, and for a moment he said nothing. The candle on the table burned without wavering. The stove at its lowest setting ticked quietly in the corner. The air that came out of the doorway around him was warmer than the air outside, not dramatically so, but measurably unmistakably. "There's a storm coming," he said. "Weather Service is calling it significant. They're using the word historic, which they don't use much." He paused. "They're saying 3 to 5 feet, sustained winds over 50, temperature dropping to -15 by the second day." She had lived in West Virginia long enough to know what that combination meant for the mountain. Not a winter storm, a siege. "When?" she asked. 2 days, maybe less. He looked around the interior one more time at the earthen walls, at the corbelled stone ceiling, with its packed clay and turf at the door, with its improvised insulation at the candle. His expression was that of a man doing a calculation he had not expected to be doing. She could see him adjusting something in his understanding of what she had built, revising a judgment he had made months ago and maintained quietly since. He did not say what he was thinking. He said he had livestock to bring in and return down the trail. She spent the rest of that day and all of the next preparing. She brought in every piece of firewood she had accumulated, not much 2 weeks of careful foraging enough to fill the small storage space she had built along the entrance wall. She filled every container she had with water and set them in the interior where they would not freeze. She checked the door, shimmed the corner gap one final time with the strip cut from the sleeping bag's outer shell that she could afford to sacrifice, and tested the seal by lighting the candle near the frame. The flame barely moved. The night before the storm, the wind outside died. It was a silence that people on the mountain recognized viscerally rather than consciously, the silence of the gray widow pulling back before a real effort, the way a wave withdraws before it breaks. She sat on the stool with the stove running and ate a dinner of rice and canned tomatoes from Earl's mason jar and read the last pages of Harold's notebook, which she had been saving without meaning to. The final entry was a list of stone sources on the ridge, which outcroppings yielded which kinds of material, written in the same precise hand as everything else, with no indication that it was the last thing he wrote. It ended mid-sentence describing a seam of good flagstone near the north fence line, and then there was nothing. 19 years of living on this mountain reduced to a notebook in a circled sentence, and a deed that he had walked down to the county clerk and filed himself because he understood that useful things should outlast the people who make them. She closed the notebook and put it on the shelf next to the mason jars. Outside, the stillness had the quality of a held breath. She blew out the candle and lay down in the dark and listened to nothing, which was not quite peaceful, but was a different category of sensation than the fear she had brought up this mountain in October. The ground beneath the floorboards was doing what it had been doing in all autumn, holding the summer down in its bones, patient and enormous and indifferent to the calendar. She could not feel it precisely, but she could feel the absence of the cold that should have been there, the way you notice a sound only when it stops. She slept. The storm hit at 4 in the morning, which she knew because she woke to it, not to noise but to the sudden presence of pressure, the sensation of the mountain absorbing a blow. The wind hit the ridge like something that had been traveling a long way and had not lost any momentum in the journey. She could hear it as a deep, continuous roar above the turf roof, not the high shrieking of the gray widow in its ordinary moods, but something lower and more sustained, the sound of weather that has decided to stay. She lay still and listened. The roar was real and constant, and entirely exterior. Inside the structure, the air did not stir. The cold did not change. The silence in the room was the silence of deep earth, of geological time, of something so far below the surface weather that the storm overhead was simply irrelevant to it. She lit the candle. The flame rose straight and stood there. She put a piece of wood in the stove. She had rationed the supply carefully and knew she had enough for 12 days at this rate, and made coffee and sat on the stool and listened to the blizzard attempting the mountain. It was doing serious damage, she did not doubt that. She had lived in frame houses during winter storms, and she knew what they felt like from the inside, the draft and that found every gap, the heat that left through the walls. No matter how much you burn, the sound of the structure itself absorbing the load and saying so. The houses in Millhaven were groaning right now. The families in those houses were burning wood at a rate that would outlast their stockpiles if the storm held longer than expected. She ate breakfast. She washed the tin cup in the water basin. She opened Harold's notebook to the stone source list and made a copy of it in the back of her own notebook, because Harold's pages were beginning to soften at the edges from handling, and she did not want to lose the information. Outside, the storm tightened. Below the mountain in the valley, Earl Dutton sat next to his kitchen stove and listened to the farmhouse make sounds it had not made in the 3 generations his family had owned it. The west wall, the wall that faced the primary wind exposure, was vibrating at a frequency he could feel in his back teeth. The windows were shuttered, but the shutters were old and one had already cracked at the top hinge and was now doing only half its job. The kitchen was the warmest room, and it was still cold enough that he could see his breath near the floor. His firewood stacked against the south wall of the barn with what he had calculated as a 6-week margin of safety was burning at a rate that was going to eliminate that margin in 3 days. He had lived on this land for 40 years, and he was not given to catastrophizing. He was given to observation and to trusting his observations. What he observed on the morning of the 2nd day of the storm was that his roof was making a sound that roofs made before they failed, a deep intermittent groan that was not the storm talking through the structure, but the structure talking about itself. He put on his coat and went up to the attic with a flashlight and looked at the main rafter over the bedroom wing and saw the crack that had opened along the grain 3 feet long, dark against the pale wood. Not catastrophic, not yet, but the snow was still coming and the weight was still building and the crack was not going to repair itself. He came back down to the kitchen and sat at the table. He was 63 years old and he had been cold before and he had managed things before, and he sat with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to a man assessing a situation without the option of assistance, calculating what he has and what he needs and whether those 2 things can be made to meet. Then he picked up the phone and called Jake. The connection was poor. The line was physical, not cellular, which was why it was working at all. But the ice on the poles was causing interference that came and went. Jake's voice was clear enough. Earl told him about the rafter. He told him about the firewood calculation. He told him the temperature in the kitchen. Jake listened, and Earl could hear him running the same calculation that Earl had already run. Dad, a pause. Go to the woman on the ridge. In this. It was not a question. You said she built into the mountain. You told me about the excavation, the corbel roof. Earth-sheltered structures maintain 50 to 55 degrees passively in winter. You told me the interior was warm when you went inside. Dad, she's warmer up there right now than you are in the house. Another pause. Earl looked at the window at the white moving outside it that was not snow falling, but snow traveling horizontally. He thought about the trail up to Goat's Ridge, which he had walked 50 times and could probably walk in darkness in reasonable conditions. These were not reasonable conditions. He thought about what Mara had built into that mountain, and about the candle standing straight on the table, and about Janet, his wife, who had been afraid of very little in her life, and who had never confused stubbornness with courage, knowing the difference mattered. She might not have room, Earl said. It's 14 feet deep and 10 feet wide. She has room. He ended the call and put on everything he had. Long underwear, wool socks, doubled his heaviest flannel, the insulated overalls from the coat hook, the down jacket on top of that, the wool cap pulled to his eyebrows, two scarves. His boots were good. He had paid for good boots because his feet were on the ground all day, every day, and he had never regretted the expense. He found the hickory walking stick he kept by the back door, and he went out into it. The wind hit him at the back steps with the physical weight of moving air compressed by the ridge into something that behaved more like water than atmosphere. He turned his shoulder to it and started moving. The first 100 yards he could use the fence line as a guide, keeping one gloved hand on the top wire where it was not buried. Past the fence, the ground sloped upward and the trail began, and he lost the fence and had only the shape of the land under the snow in 40 years of knowing it. He fell for the first time at what he estimated was a quarter-mile, catching his boot on a buried stone and going down sideways, the hickory stick skidding out of reach. He got up, found the stick, kept going. The second fall was at the gully crossing where the bank had drifted to waist height, and he stepped over the edge without seeing it. He went in up to his chest, the cold of the snow against his torso, something beyond uncomfortable, a systemic shock that he felt in his back teeth before his hands found the opposite bank and he pulled himself out. He stood for a moment at the top of the gully, breathing his face against the wind that was trying to push him back down into it. His legs had gone to something heavier than tired, a dense, unresponsive quality that he recognized as the beginning of a problem. He thought about Janet. He thought about what she had said once years ago when he had been planning to push through something that didn't need to be pushed through that day. The difference between brave and foolish is whether you survive it. He had always thought she was right about that, and he thought so now, and he also thought that going back down into the house with the cracked rafter and the diminishing firewood was not survival either. It was just a slower version of the alternative. He kept going. The third fall was bad. He went down on his right side on a section of the trail that had iced under the snow, and he slid 4 feet before he stopped. And when he pushed himself up, his right arm was slower than it should have been. He made himself move the fingers. They moved. He kept going. The fourth time he went down, he did not get up immediately. He lay in the snow on his back and looked up at the white sky that was not sky but snow. And he breathed, and he thought with the clarity that comes when the body is conserving its commentary for the essentials. I have come this far. The distance remaining is less than the distance traveled. These are facts. He sat up. He found the hickory stick. He pushed himself to his feet with the stick as a brace, his right arm doing less of the work than it should. He was on the upper section of the trail, which he knew because the grade had increased and the rock outcroppings were more frequent, which meant he was above the tree line, which meant he was close. He could see nothing. Visibility had dropped to the length of his arm. In any direction, the world reduced to a white that was the same in every direction and had no gradient. He moved by the feel of the grade under his feet and the angle of the wind on his face, using the mountain shape as a compass. He walked into the front wall of the structure with his shoulder. The impact stopped him. His face was 12 inches from the stone, close enough to see it in. The whiteout gray granite fitted solid. He moved along it to the left until his hand found the door frame. He knocked. Inside, Mara was reading. The knock came through the door as a muffled impact, irregular, heavier than a person using their knuckles in the ordinary way. She set the notebook down. She opened the door. The cold that came in was brief, displaced immediately by the interior air, and then Earl was inside and she closed the door behind him, and he stood in a small room with snow encasing his shoulders and hat and the entirety of his front surface. In his face was the face of a man who has spent the last resources of an argument and arrived at the conclusion. He said, "My roof." She had already moved to the stove, adding wood, filling the tin cup with the water she had kept on the back of the stove for the residual warmth. She handed it to him. He took it with both hands, which she noticed the grip was not what it should be on the right side. She knelt and pulled off his right boot. The foot was cold but not white. She pulled off the left. Better. He sat on the stool. The candle on the table burned straight and still. He looked at it for a while with the expression of a man revising a position he had held for a long time. "It doesn't move," he said, meaning the flame. "No," she said, "it doesn't." He looked at the earthen walls, at the packed ceiling, at the door she had built from packing crate lumber and salvaged wool. He looked at the small stove doing its minimal work in the corner. He was running the same calculation Jake had run on the phone, but with the answer in front of him rather than on the other end of a telephone line. The temperature in the room was 58 degrees. Outside on the ridge, the storm was performing at its full capacity, and the temperature was falling through -10 on its way somewhere worse. How the word came out stripped of everything except the question itself. She looked at the walls, at the ceiling, at the candle. She thought about how to explain thermal mass and passive insulation and the specific heat capacity of granite and the way the Earth's deep temperature gradient worked. And she thought about Harold's circled sentence. And she thought about Grandma Ruth on the back porch in the snow, with both hands around a mug of coffee. She thought about the fact that none of those things were what he was actually asking. "I stopped trying to fight it," she said. "I just listened to what the mountain was already doing." Earl looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully read. It was not gratitude exactly, and it was not admiration exactly, but it contained both of those things and something older than either of them. The look of a man who has lived long enough to recognize the difference between intelligence and a particular kind of attention that intelligence alone does not produce. He wrapped both hands around the tin cup and drank. Outside, the storm leaned into the mountain with everything it had, and the mountain did not move. And inside the room, the candle burned without wavering through the whole long night. The storm ran for 51 hours. Mara knew this because she counted them not obsessively, but in the way of someone with no external calendar marking time, by the stove's cycles, in the slow drain of the candle, in the quality of the sound above the turf roof, which changed in ways she had learned to read. The first 20 hours were the full force of it, the sustained roar that had no pause and no variation. The mountain absorbing the blows with the indifference of something that had been absorbing blows for 300 million years, and had not yet found one worth acknowledging. The next 18 hours were the storm at its cruising altitude, still violent, but with a rhythm to it. Now the gusts coming in sets like waves counted by a sailor who has stopped being afraid of the water and started paying attention to its patterns. The last 13 hours were the slow withdrawal, the wind dropping by increments too small to celebrate individually, but accumulating into a silence that arrived on the third morning like a door being closed in a distant room. Earl slept through most of the first night on the bed, which Mara had insisted on moving the sleeping bag to the floor herself, with the finality of someone who has decided that argument is a form of energy expenditure she cannot afford. He did not protest. His body had made the decision before his pride could organize a position, and he was asleep within 10 minutes of lying down, his breathing slow and deliberate in the way of a man whose reserves have been fully spent. She sat on the stool through the dark hours, keeping the stove at its minimal setting, making small adjustments to the damper that she had learned to make without looking. The temperature in the room held between 55 and 60 throughout the night. She did not sleep, but she was not exactly awake either. She was in the state the mountain had taught her, a condition of sustained attention that was neither restless nor passive, simply present. By the second morning, Earl was functional. He moved carefully, the right arm still protective of itself, but he ate the rice and canned tomatoes she heated on the stove and drank the coffee and looked at the door with the focused attention of a man who has decided to be useful rather than grateful, because usefulness is its own form of debt repayment. He asked her what needed doing. She told him the east drainage channel had been making sounds before the storm that suggested it might be partially blocked by debris. He put on his layers and went outside to check it. He was back in 20 minutes with his face red from the cold, reporting that the channel was clear, but that the snow depth on the roof was approximately 18 inches within the load tolerance for the corbel design, he said. And she did not ask how he knew the load tolerance, because the answer was Jake, and some information arrives before the conversation that explains it. She had been thinking about Frank and Norma Pierce since the first hour of the storm. This was not sentimentality, it was arithmetic. The Pierces lived in the oldest occupied structure in Millhaven proper, a balloon frame house built in 1931 that had been maintained with the loving attention of people who understood its age and the less loving attention of a county heating system that had been installed in 1987 and serviced irregularly since. Frank was 78 and moved with the deliberate economy of a man who has learned to spend his physical capacity carefully. Norma was 75 and ran the household with a precision that had kept them both functional and independent in a house that required ongoing negotiation with its own limitations. Their furnace ran on a flue that Mara had heard Frank mention once at the Millhaven diner, in the way of someone describing a manageable problem that had become familiar. The flue cap was original to the installation and had a tendency to ice over in heavy snow, restricting the draft and eventually shutting the furnace down. 51 hours of historic blizzard. A 1987 furnace with a vulnerable flue cap. 2 people in their late 70s, she told Earl. He pulled on his coat without discussion. The descent from Goats Ridge in the storm's aftermath was a different physical experience than any other walk she had taken on this mountain. The snow had reorganized the landscape drifts of 6 and 7 feet in the natural channels and depressions, the trail itself obliterated so thoroughly that she navigated by the angle of the slope and the position of the rock outcroppings she had memorized over months of daily passage. Earl moved behind her using the hickory stick as a probe in the deeper sections, testing before committing weight. The temperature was 6 degrees. The wind had dropped to a steady 15 miles an hour, which was cold but manageable after what the previous 2 days had offered. The road through Millhaven had not been plowed. It would not be plowed for another 8 hours. The county had 2 plows for 400 miles of secondary road, and they worked in order of population density, which meant the valley towns first and the mountain approaches last. The road was a white corridor between buried fence lines, the surface unmarked by any tire track, and they walked down the center of it in single file, their breath going up in columns in the still cold air. The Pierce house sat on the south end of Millhaven's main street, a 2-story white clapboard with green shutters. The porch wrapped around the east and south faces its railings buried in drift. The upstairs windows were dark. The downstairs front window showed no light. No smoke from the chimney. The absence of smoke was the information she had been dreading since they left the ridge. She knocked. The sound her knock made hollow, unabsorbed, told her the interior temperature before the door opened. Frank Pierce opened the door in a wool blanket, worn as a cape, his face carrying the gray undertone of someone who had been cold for too long, the kind of cold that stops feeling like cold and starts feeling like a general diminishment of everything. He looked at Mara, then at Earl, then back at Mara, and something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, because relief requires the prior expectation of help, and Frank Pierce had not been expecting anyone. It was closer to the expression of someone who has revised a fundamental assumption about how the world works and is not yet certain what to do with the revision. Furnace went out at 11 last night, he said. Norma's in the front room under everything we own. Norma Pierce was on the sofa under 4 quilts and a winter coat, her eyes open and tracking her color not good. She was conscious and oriented. She knew who had come in. She asked about the road conditions. She made a comment about the storm that suggested her mind was working, but her hands, when Mara touched them, were the temperature of the room, which was 38 degrees, according to the gauge on the kitchen wall. Earl found the furnace in the basement. The flue cap had iced over exactly as Mara had predicted, creating a complete blockage that had tripped the furnace's safety shutoff at 11 the previous night. He chipped the ice from the exterior cap with a hammer he found on Frank's workbench, restored the draft, confirmed the ignition was functional, and restarted the furnace from the basement controls. The sound of it coming on the click and whomp of the burner catching was one of the most useful sounds Mara had ever heard. She stayed until the downstairs temperature reached 55 degrees. She made tea on Frank's electric stove, which worked because the power had come back at some point during the night after a 6-hour outage, and she sat with Norma, while the color came back and the hands warmed. Earl sat across the room and said very little, which was appropriate. Frank made an attempt at conversation, then abandoned it in favor of simply sitting near his wife and watching her improve, which was the only thing he actually wanted to do. When Norma's color had normalized and she was asking about the road conditions with the specificity of someone making plans, rather than filling silence, Frank turned to Mara. He was holding his wife's hand. His own color had improved. He looked at Mara with the direct gaze of a man who is accustomed to saying what he means and has decided that this moment requires it. I heard you were up there digging holes in the mountain. Thought you'd lost your mind from the grief. Mara did not say anything. My nephew told me about the lawsuit, about what Garrett was after. He paused. I've known Garrett Calloway since he was 12 years old. I knew his father. Another pause. I should have said something. When he was going around town calling you grief crazy and talking to Ron Hicks, I should have said something then. The room was quiet except for the furnace noise coming up through the floor registers. You're saying something now, Mara said. Frank looked at their joined hands. His and Norma's, the knuckles of both of them swollen with age, the skin thin and mapped with the record of everything they had done with those hands over 7.5 decades. Some lessons come at a cost, he said. The expensive ones are the ones that stick. She left them with enough tea and the assurance that the furnace was running. She and Earl walked back up the mountain road in the early afternoon light, the sun coming out for the first time in 3 days and turning the snow into something that was hard to look at directly. Neither of them spoke much. There was a quality to the silence between them that had not been there before the storm, a familiarity that had not been negotiated or decided but had simply accumulated, the way heat accumulates in stone gradually without announcement, until one day it is simply there and the stone is warm. The damage in Millhaven revealed itself over the following days as the snow compacted and the roads opened and people emerged from what their houses had done to them during the storm. 7 roofs had taken structural damage, 2 of them complete failures. The entire roof deck collapsed under the snow load, the families inside having retreated to lower floors when the sounds above became unambiguous. One house on the north end of town was a total loss, the owner having been at his sister's in Elkins when the storm hit and returned to a building that had become uninhabitable in his absence. The Hendersons, the same family who had paid $8 for Mara's mother's saucers at the auction, had a partial wall failure on the windward side that had let in 2 feet of snow through the living room. They were staying with the Hendersons' daughter in Beverly until it could be repaired. Frank and Norma Pierce were transported to Davis Medical Center in Elkins 2 days after the storm, not because they were in crisis, but because their doctor, reached by phone once the lines were clear, wanted to evaluate them for cold exposure effects that sometimes manifested delayed. They were kept for 3 days of observation, discharged without lasting damage, and returned to Millhaven in a county transport van with a new flue cap on the furnace and a space heater in the bedroom as backup, both arranged by their daughter in Wheeling, who had not previously understood that her parents' heating situation required attention. Earl's son Jake arrived in Millhaven 4 days after the storm ended, driving a truck from Charleston with tire chains and a bed full of lumber and tools because Earl had described the rafter situation in enough detail that Jake had decided to come and look at it himself before the next weather system arrived. He spent a day and a half on the farmhouse roof in temperatures that had climbed back to the low 20s, sistering the cracked rafter with new lumber and adding blocking along 3 adjacent bays that had shown stress. Earl handed tools and held things in place and did not tell Jake that he was grateful, which Jake understood as the compliment it was. On the second day, Jake walked up to Goats Ridge. He was 35 and had a structural engineer's way of looking at built things, not aesthetically but mechanically, seeing the forces rather than the forms, understanding what was carrying load and what was pretending to. He stood at the entrance of the structure for a moment before going in, looking at the turf roof, at the dry stack front face, at the way the ground rose behind and above, and she could see him doing the calculation that his training had made automatic, working out the geometry of load paths in thermal mass and moisture management. Then he ducked through the door. He stood inside for a long time without saying anything. He looked at the corbelled ceiling, running his hand along the underside of the stone courses, feeling the geometry of the overlap. He looked at the rear wall, at the angle of the stones keyed into the earth bank. He crouched and looked at the base of the walls, at the drainage channels. He stood at the center of the room and held his hand flat palm down at waist height, feeling for drafts. There were none. "This is earth-sheltered construction," he said, and the phrase carried in his voice the particular tone of someone naming something they have studied in textbooks and are now seeing executed in stone and dirt by a person with no architectural training. The thermal mass alone, the earth contact on 3 walls, and the overhead, this should maintain 45 to 55 degrees passively, regardless of exterior temperature, which is exactly what it did. He looked at the stove in the corner. "How much wood did you use during the storm?" She told him. He did the math, visibly running through the BTU implication, and his expression confirmed the number was as small as it sounded. "People spend $40,000–$50,000 to build these with an architect and a contractor in engineered systems," he said. "You built one with a pickaxe and a dead man's notebook, and it performed within the expected range for a properly designed earth-sheltered structure." He paused. "Harold wasn't Daniel's uncle by blood, right? He was his father's brother." "That's right." Harold knew what he was doing there when he circled that sentence. Jake looked at the shelf where the notebook sat between the mason jars. He was leaving a schematic for whoever came next. He just couldn't know who that would be or when. This was the same thought Rebecca Oates had expressed on the courthouse steps in different language, and Mara found it striking that 2 people who had never met had arrived at the same observation independently, that Harold had prepared something useful for a future he could not see, with a specificity that suggested he understood the preparation mattered even in the absence of a recipient. She thought about what kind of faith that required. Not religious faith, or not only that, but the faith of a practical man who has decided that useful things should outlast their makers and has acted on that decision without requiring proof that anyone will come to use them. The county commission voted on the wind energy development proposal in the second week of February as scheduled. The vote was 4-1 in favor of advancing 3 ridgeline sites to the development phase. Goats Ridge was one of the 3. The dissenting vote was cast by a commissioner from the Northern District who objected on scenic grounds, which was noted in the minutes and had no practical effect. Rebecca Oates called Mara at Earl's farm. Mara still had no phone on the ridge, a situation she was not in any hurry to change, and explained the lease structure. The development company would pay an annual ground lease for each turbine sited on her property. Based on the preliminary survey, 2 to 4 turbines could be positioned on her parcel's ridgeline section. The annual income per turbine would be between $2,200 and $2,600 depending on the final siting. Total annual income somewhere between $4,400 and $10,400 depending on how many turbines in the final rate negotiation. Garrett was looking at 10–12 turbines across the whole ridgeline if he'd consolidated the parcels, Rebecca said. Your 4 acres is only a piece of it, but it's a piece he couldn't go around. Mara thought about the check on the kitchen table, $3,200, the flat hands on either side of it. What happened to his application, she asked, meaning the other parcels Garrett had presumably been pursuing. He acquired 2 of them before the lawsuit made the papers, Rebecca said. The third owner, a man named Cecil Holt, 60 years old, farms the eastern slope, read the Recorder article and called me the following week. Cecil's lease application is being processed separately from yours. Garrett's 2 parcels are sandwiched between you and Cecil. A pause. The development company will need access easements across Garrett's land to reach the turbine sites. Easement negotiations are handled parcel by parcel. The people on either side of a landlocked parcel have a certain amount of leverage in those negotiations. She sat with this for a moment, understanding the geometry of it. Garrett had spent months engineering a situation in which he held all the pieces. The current situation had rearranged the board so that the pieces he held were only useful with the cooperation of the people he had tried to dispossess. "He'll negotiate," Mara said. "He'll negotiate," Rebecca agreed. "He's a practical man when his options are clear." The three families who had lost the most to the storm came to see her in the last week of February when the snow had compacted enough that the ridge trail was passable with effort. They came together, which she suspected was deliberate. Arriving as a group made the ask feel less like charity and more like a proposal, which was in fact what it was. She recognized all three, the Weaver family, Tom and Sandra, and their two daughters, whose east wall failure had been the most dramatic. A young couple named Briggs, who had been in Millhaven for only 18 months and whose rental property had been condemned, and a man named Garrett Stewart. No relation, a coincidence that would have been funny in different circumstances, who had been in the county for 40 years and whose roof collapse had been total, the weight of the snow exceeding what the aging structure could bear. They stood in the entrance of her structure while she stood inside the geometry of the doorway, putting her at the same level as them rather than above or below. They did not ask where money or materials or connections. They asked whether she would help them build the way she had built. She looked at them. Sandra Weaver had two children behind her, the older one, perhaps 10, holding the younger one's hand with the automatic protectiveness of a child who has learned recently that the world contains more uncertainty than previously advertised. Garrett Stewart had the look of a man who has reached the age at which starting over is genuinely difficult and has decided to start anyway, which is a different kind of courage than the kind available to the young. The Briggs couple were young enough that they still moved with the physical confidence of people who have not yet had occasion to learn their limits, but something in the way they held themselves had changed. The storm had introduced them to a category of experience their youth had not yet included. She thought about standing in the foundation of Stone Hollow, with her cheek near the cavity in the ground, feeling the warmth that the mountain had been holding since July. She thought about the pickaxe in her hands and the $47,000 of debt in Garrett's hands flat on either side of the check. She thought about the morning after the roof section collapsed, sitting in the dark with Helen's candle while the flames stood straight in the windless, earth-sheltered air, the most basic possible evidence that the idea was working. There was nothing heroic about what she had done. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind, because heroism was a narrative that would eventually require her to be more than she was, and she could not sustain that. She had done what the situation required. She had listened to what the mountain was offering, and she had accepted the offer, and in doing so she had learned things that were now of practical use to people who needed them. That was not heroism. That was the ordinary transmission of hard-won knowledge from one person to the people who came next, which was what human beings had been doing on cold mountains since before anyone thought to name the practice. "Come back Saturday," she said. "Bring shovels." Jake Dutton drove up from Charleston every weekend for 12 weeks. He came with his truck and his training and a willingness to defer to Mara on the specifics of the local stone and the local ground, which made the collaboration functional in a way that complementary knowledge usually does when the people involved can resist the temptation to assert authority over the parts they do not actually understand. He handled the structural calculations, confirming that the corbel spans were within safe tolerances and specifying the minimum bearing surfaces for header stones in each specific application. She handled everything else: the site selection, the excavation approach, the stone sourcing, the earthwork. The Weaver family structure went up first because the daughters needed a place before the school year ended, and because Sandra Weaver turned out to have an aptitude for dry stack work that became apparent on the third day and accelerated the wall construction significantly. She had a feel for the stones. She could hold one and assess its faces in a few seconds, turning it in her hands the way a person turns a tool to find the grip, and she placed them with an accuracy that came from something closer to intuition than training. Mara watched her and thought about the ways that particular skills are distributed without regard to the preparation of the people who carry them. Tom Weaver did the excavation work, which suited his build and temperament. He was a man who thought well while his body was occupied, and the rhythm of the pickaxe seemed to help him process whatever he was working through about the storm and its damage, and the particular rearrangement of priorities that extreme events perform on a person's understanding of what matters. By the fourth week, he was excavating at a pace that made Mara's early progress look tentative, which was as it should be. She had learned on a curve that included many failures. He had the benefit of her failures already accounted for. Garrett Stewart's structure was the most technically demanding because the site he had chosen, the only part of his property that had the necessary slope and stone composition, required an entrance orientation that put the door facing northeast, which was also the primary wind exposure on that section of the ridge. Jake spent 2 evenings on the phone with a colleague in Morgantown working through the thermal implications, and the solution they arrived at involved a short entry vestibule with a second inner door, creating an airlock that prevented the direct exchange of interior and exterior air each time the door was open. It added 3 weeks to the construction. Garrett Stewart did not complain. He worked on it every day, learning the core bell technique from Mara, with the focused attention of a man who understands that what he is learning has a specific and immediate application and cannot afford to be theoretical. The Briggs couple, whose youth the others had initially mistaken for a disadvantage, turned out to be the most physically productive builders of the group, capable of sustaining the excavation work for longer daily hours than anyone else, and recovering overnight in a way that the older participants had ceased to find reasonable to expect of their own bodies. What they lacked was the patience for the wall work, which required attention to detail that physical energy alone could not supply. This was solved by pairing one of them with Sandra Weaver on the wall courses and letting the other work with Tom Weaver on excavation, a division of labor that emerged organically within the first 2 weeks and was never formally discussed. Earl came up the ridge on the weekends when Jake was there and worked without being asked on the tasks that did not require instruction. Clearing excavated material from the work zones, fetching and sorting stone from the supply piles, maintaining the common tools. He and Jake worked in the easy parallel silence of people who know each other well enough to communicate through the economy of coordinated movement, each anticipating what the other needs before the need is articulated. Mara watched them and thought about what it meant to have a son who drove 4 hours on weekends to help with something that was not his project in weather, that was not inviting for reasons that were not transactional. She thought it probably meant the same thing that Janet Dutton's absence meant to Earl in the way he talked about her, not grief as loss. Though it was that too, but grief as the ongoing evidence of what had been there, the negative space that only forms around something that was solid. The 3 structures were complete by the first week of May. They were not identical. Each one was adapted to its specific site, the wall heights and entrance orientation and drainage solutions specific to the ground they occupied. But they shared the essential quality that Mara had discovered in the pit of Stone Hollow on a November morning with their cheek near the earth. They were part of the mountain rather than objects placed on it, and the mountain was doing most of the work. A professor from West Virginia University's College of Engineering arrived in June, a woman named Patricia Crane, who studied sustainable building systems and had read the Randolph County Recorder's coverage of the Goats Ridge community, the name the paper had given to the cluster of earth-sheltered structures on the ridge, which was not a name anyone on the ridge had chosen, but which had adhered anyway the way names do when they are accurate enough. Patricia Crane wanted to monitor the thermal performance of the structures through a full seasonal cycle and write a case study for a journal that her colleagues at other universities actually read. Mara told her she could monitor what she wanted on the condition that she explained every piece of equipment she installed and its purpose, and that she share her findings with the families before she published them, and that she understand the structures were people's homes and not a research facility. Patricia Crane agreed to all 3 conditions without hesitation, which suggested she had encountered enough of the alternative that she recognized reasonable terms when she heard them. The monitoring equipment went in over 2 days in late June, small sensors embedded in the walls at various depths, recording temperature and humidity at 15-minute intervals, transmitting wirelessly to a data logger that Patricia Crane could access remotely from Morgantown. She came back in September to check the equipment and review the initial data, and she sat at Mara's table with a laptop showing 6 months of thermal readings and said with the careful neutrality of someone trained to let data do the arguing, the passive thermal performance of this structure is within 10% of what we'd project for a professionally designed and engineered earth-sheltered home. The Corbel roof is losing slightly more heat than a poured concrete roof would, but you've compensated with the turf depth. The overall envelope is performing. Mara looked at the data, which was a series of lines on a graph that she could read well enough to understand the story they told, a relatively flat interior temperature line running through the winter months, varying less than 15 degrees across the full seasonal range, while the exterior temperature line spiked and dropped in the dramatic pattern of a West Virginia mountain year. The gap between the two lines was the mountain doing its work. Harold would have liked seeing that. She said not to Patricia Crane, but to herself or to Harold or to whatever it was she was in the habit of addressing when she said things she was not certain anyone needed to hear. Patricia Crane looked up from the laptop. Harold Calloway, the original builder. He knew the ground breathed warm in November, Mara said. He wrote it down and circled it. He just didn't have the sensors to prove it. The wind farm construction began the following spring. The turbine bases drilled into the ridgeline above Stone Hollow through the winter, and the towers assembled in March, a process that involved equipment Mara had never seen working at close-range cranes that could reach heights she could not quite reconcile with the scale of the ridge trucks. With tires taller than she was, teams of workers in high-visibility vests who arrived at dawn and left before dark and ate their lunches sitting on the cab steps of the heavy equipment, looking out over the valley with the comfortable indifference of people who have learned not to become attached to the views from their job sites. 3 turbines went up on her parcel. They were larger than she had expected from the survey markers, the blades spanning an area wider than a football field, the slow rotation visible from the valley floor on clear days. The sound they made was not the grinding mechanical noise she had anticipated, but something softer and more continuous, a low rhythmic pulse that she stopped hearing after 2 weeks, the way she had stopped smelling the earth inside the structure. The lease payments began arriving in April, deposited directly to the account Rebecca Oates had helped her establish, a number that was not wealth, but was stability, which was a different and in some ways more useful thing. Garrett Calloway negotiated his access easements without drama. He was represented by a different attorney than the one from the quiet title action which was noted. The terms were not punitive, they were market rate for the easement type, which was all they needed to be, because market rate in this case represented a significant ongoing payment to Mara and Cecil Holt for access across their properties that Garrett could not develop his turbine sites without. He signed. He did not attend the signing in person, which was probably wise. His 2 parcels now had turbines on them and were generating lease income, which meant the situation had resolved itself in a way that was economically functional for everyone involved, and economics has a way of smoothing the narrative of grievances between people who are all benefiting from the same outcome. The Weaver daughters had named the 3 turbines on Mara's parcel. She did not ask them to, and was not sure when it happened. But one afternoon, the older one, whose name was Claire, who was 11 by then, and had developed the habit of spending hours on the ridge watching the blades turn, informed her that the turbines were named Harold, Ruth, and Daniel in that order, from north to south. Mara looked at the 3 towers against the sky and thought about the logic of the naming, which was not the logic of sentiment, but the logic of accuracy. Those were the 3 people whose specific knowledge and specific faith had made the ridge what it was. The 11-year-old had understood this without being told, which was the best possible evidence that some things communicate themselves. The following October, 2 years and a few weeks after the auction in the yard, Mara sat on the low front wall of Stone Hollow in the late afternoon and watched the light change on the valley. The ridge had the look it got in the hour before full dark, the granite going from gray to a deep blue-gray, the turf roofs catching the last horizontal light and holding it briefly green against the stone. The turbines turned above in the diminishing wind. Below in the valley, the lights of Millhaven were coming on one by one in the early dusk. She was not thinking about anything in particular. This was a state she had come to in increments over the 2 years, the ability to sit in a place without requiring the place to perform or justify itself, without needing the moment to mean something beyond what it was. The mountain did not do anything for her that it did not do for everyone. It held heat in its bones and offered the evidence of that holding to anyone willing to go deep enough to find it. What she had done was pay attention to the offer. A child's footsteps on the trail, Claire Weaver, in the orange jacket she wore, regardless of temperature, once the weather turned cold. She came up the last section of trail at a run that slowed to a walk when she saw Mara, not from shyness, but from the natural deceleration of someone arriving at a place where running seemed like the wrong pace. She stopped near the wall and looked up at Harold, the northernmost turbine. "My mom says you used to live in a tent up here," Claire said. "For a while," Mara said. "Was it cold?" "Very." Claire considered this with the thoroughness of someone for whom the question is not rhetorical. She had grown up in an earth-sheltered home, which meant her baseline understanding of what a house was and how it worked was different from every child in Millhaven below the ridge. She knew that warmth came from the ground and not only from fire. She knew that stone remembered summer. She knew these things not as facts she had been taught, but as the texture of ordinary experience, the way children know the things that are simply true about the world they were handed. "Why didn't you just build inside sooner?" she asked, meaning the mountain. The question was so direct and so reasonable that Mara almost smiled. The honest answer was complicated. It involved a check on a kitchen table and a pair of eyes going to a ridge, and a woman who had nothing left to lose, deciding that the absence of anything to protect was a kind of freedom, and it involved a cavity in the ground, in the memory of a Kentucky porch and a notebook full of careful drawings left by a man who understood that useful things should outlast the people who make them. It involved the specific gravity of grief and the way desperation, when it has nowhere else to go, sometimes walks straight through the door that wisdom has been standing in front of for years. But Claire was 11, and the wind was picking up, and there was a simpler answer that was also true. "I didn't know to listen yet," Mara said. Claire nodded in the way of someone filing information for future use. She looked at the turbines one more time, then turned and went back down the trail at a run that suggested she had somewhere else to be, and the energy to get there, the orange jacket flickering through the scrub until the trail curved and she was gone. Mara sat with the quiet the departure left. Below, the lights of Millhaven had multiplied in the dusk. Above, the three turbines turned in the evening wind with the slow, patient rotation of things that have been built to work for a long time and are doing exactly that. Harold, Ruth, Daniel, the names of people who had known things and passed them forward through the specific mediums available to them. A circled sentence, a voice on a porch in the snow, a life lived alongside someone who was paying attention. She put her hand flat on the stone of the wall she had built and felt the cold of the granite surface, and underneath it, underneath the surface temperature, and the evening air and the season, the deeper temperature that the mountain maintained, regardless of what the weather was doing. It was not warmth in any dramatic sense. It was the simple, stubborn persistence of a system too large to be overruled by a single winter, holding what it had gathered across all the months that the sun had touched it, refusing to give it up entirely just because the light had changed. She had spent 2 years learning to call that reliability, rather than miracle, which was the more respectful name for it. Miracles required intervention. What the mountain did required nothing except being left to work. She stood up from the wall, brushed the stone dust from her hands, and went inside. The candle on the table was where she had left it. She lit it with one of Helen's matches. She still bought them from Helen, the same wooden matches in the same red box, a habit she had not examined and did not intend to. The flame rose without hesitation in the still air of the room and stood straight and steady, the same as it had on the first night she had lit a candle in this place, the same as it had during the storm, the same as it would on any night she chose to light it, because the air inside the mountain did not behave according to the weather's rules and never had and would not begin now. She put the kettle on the stove and waited for the water to heat and listened to the mountain doing its quiet work around her, steady and enormous, and completely indifferent to whether anyone understood it, which was she had come to believe the purest form of reliability there was.